Thanks for joining us for today's discussion that we developed in collaboration with our amazing partners at Bloomberg Philanthropies and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Today, we'll be discussing how cities can take advantage of the federal resources provided by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act to help cities become more resilient after the impacts of climate change and extreme weather. These resources, which we'll be discussing today, include the $1.4 billion provided by the Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation Grant Program, also known as the PROTECT Grant Program, the nearly $3 billion provided by the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program, also known as the BRIC Grant Program, and all of the funds provided by all of the FEMA grant and loan programs designed to help cities address natural disasters and extreme weather. We have a lot to cover today, but before we dive in, we want to make sure that you know about two new resources that are relevant to today's. First, our guide to federal funding for disaster preparedness and resilience. And secondly, a case study on Hoboken, New Jersey's Resilient Cities Park Project, which Mayor Bala will be sharing more about today with us. As always, we want today's session to be interactive, so please feel free to share your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible during our Q&A session. I would now like to introduce Tracy Phillips, the Deputy Director of Recovery at Hagerty Consulting, an emergency management consulting firm that helps clients prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. Tracy previously served in various senior positions at FEMA, where she most recently supported the establishment of the program office responsible for the administration of approximately $7 billion in FEMA-appropriated bipartisan infrastructure law dollars. Tracy, thanks for being with us today. The floor is now yours. Tracy?
It's on mute.
Tracy, I think you might be on mute.
Okay, is that better?
Yes. Yep, we can hear you, Tracy.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you for that. Is there an echo now? I've been having sound issues all day. Nope. Okay.
Yeah, Tracy, I don't think we can hear you. It looks like you're back on mute. Thanks for your patience, everybody.
Yep, sorry about that. I think we're getting feedback though, right? Okay, maybe it's just me. Local infrastructure hub, investing in disaster preparedness. Major glacier. Is that any better?
No, Tracy, I think we're still getting a little echo. I don't know if you're logged in twice or if just once.
Hey, Tracy, you're muted on your computer. Maybe unmute the computer and mute the phone so we don't get feedback from the phone.
Right, that's what I'm doing. And it's still. Okay, did that take care of it?
I think so.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll move a little bit quickly. We're talking about resilience planning and investing in disaster preparedness. It's an integrated process that is more complicated than we would like, but it works. and we're at a particular moment in time when we have available funding that is important in the overall planning process, in not only how much is available, when it's available, and when it needs to be integrated into plans for local communities. So first, let's talk a little bit about federal resilience framework and the way to frame this up and kind of organize thoughts and make sure that everyone is aware of the funding mechanisms that are out there, the programs and what they cover, and how that integrates into local infrastructure and community needs. So when we talk about a framework, we're mainly talking about elements such as preparedness, mitigation, and resilience activities, and how those feed into infrastructure and community investment. The federal approach has shifted over the years from strictly response and recovery to mitigation and resilience. We have found over the last 25 years or so that the more preparation that's done and planning that's done for events that affect a community's day-to-day activities, as well as damages to its infrastructure and community, is tied together in a way that makes planning for it a little bit more complex. In this overall scheme, FEMA is the primary provider for assistance, but there are also 17 other federal agencies and resilience-related programs that are available. You can imagine that at the federal level, there is bureaucracy to be dealt with, and managing that as a part of grants administration and applying for grants and doing that in the right time frame is incredibly important. Providing plans that are a roadmap for when these federal actions in pursuit of resilience goals and other help at the state and local level are important to factor into planning assumptions along the way. Framing a vision for success. So providing a strategy for all of this, none of the planning can be linear. There is some planning that happens early on and before infrastructure may have been affected in some way is important. Approaching planning and the practical implementation for itemizing projects and how that fits together programmatically in what's best for a community and its stakeholders, while factoring in timelines and funding with an executive strategy as the overarching theme. Outcomes should be revenue positive. They should factor in reducing repairs, recovery, liability, and reputational costs. Risk reduction here creates an effectiveness that supports other key missions in a community and leads more toward looking at it through a broad lens of resiliency and sustainability. Resilience is an outcome that the community and institutions have a common stake in, and getting that stakeholder buy-in at the community level is incredibly important. So when we look at the scope, process, and key elements of resilience planning, it goes along a continuum, but what is important here is focusing on the how. Most plans focus on the what. How in resilience is important when making decisions about what the solutions are to community challenges and presenting them in a manner that aligns resources, partners, and priorities across key areas of vulnerability. It should ensure coordinated implementation of cross-cutting objectives and looking for methods that achieve more complicated long-term objectives. They should capture and communicate how these actions support equity in the community and should prioritize actions that will help withstand and recover any disasters and any other shocks to the system. Focus on needs that require or benefit from public support, creative financing, stakeholder alignment, and partnership are key. Overall, optimizing resources and developing funding strategies where needed across these 5 kind of elements in resilience planning are incredibly important. This slide is included for those of you who are located in disaster-prone areas. Resilience planning and funding must be integrated into your disaster response and recovery planning. Community needs, particularly related to infrastructure, become moving targets in disaster environments. Integrating resilience and infrastructure restoration is imperative. This cannot be a linear process, and you'll see in this slide, it's using the overall National Disaster Recovery Framework. And you'll see listed here some activities in preparedness before a disaster strikes. And then some of the programs are listed here that along with the phase of recovery life cycle, that those elements should be considered. So by waiting until the end of the recovery life cycle to do your long-term recovery planning, your resilience planning, and looking at the available funding and resources that are available have to happen from the very beginning. As you see which sectors are damaged more heavily or which community needs are coming to the surface as a result of whatever the disaster is, you can look at the funding opportunities and the recovery operations, and through that lens to give yourself more opportunities to be able to build back better and maximize within that decision making how to restore to the best community needs. Sometimes we found this particularly in large disasters where community needs are quite different once infrastructure is damaged after a large event. So keeping all of those things in mind and starting to at least prepare what the vision is for after the disaster is really helpful. So then we look at federal funding to support resilience. And the resilience funding overview here, I won't go into great detail here, but this is some of the major segments that through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that was passed in the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the other federal funding that's available through FEMA, HUD, and other federal partners, greenhouse gas reduction, environmental justice, so everything through an equity lens, energy and efficiency, manufacturing, resilience, and workforce. So they're pretty broad segments that are the way these things are configured together and cobbled together with the different funding opportunities that are available is can't be overemphasized as a part of planning. Normally, when we have talked about resilience planning in the past, it's basically been a part of mitigation. There are direct funding opportunities through FEMA. Now that is broadened quite a bit. And the approximately $1 trillion that is out there through these different programs is very broad in scope. And it becomes a little bit difficult to navigate. So here we're demonstrating, and these are links to some of the some of the programs with some application timeframes and with a brief description of these programs. So you've got Rebuilding American Infrastructure. And for this, the funds that surface transportation, including efforts that advance and enhance infrastructure and increase resilience against threats. And you'll see that there's a January 30th date for applications for this one. When notice of funding opportunities come out, sometimes they are very quick turnaround. So we've provided some of the ones that that are closest to our date now and things that you could be looking at immediately. Promoting resilient operations for transformative, efficient, and cost-saving transportation. PROTECT is the acronym. This makes transportation more resilient to national hazards. It's got an emphasis on climate change, sea level rise, flooding, extreme weather, and other national disasters. The third one, Building Resilience and Inclusive Communities Discretionary Grant Program, otherwise known as BRIC through FEMA. And this is, this is mitigation and against natural disasters, and through activities such as investing in community resilience and supporting protective building codes. Code enforcement, and especially in coastal areas, is incredibly important. It also gives opportunities to regionalize some of the funding in a way that wasn't available in regular mitigation grant opportunities. So this is kind of a new way to look at partnerships with communities within the BRIC program. Flood Mitigation Assistance, or FMA, is funds that focus on eliminating risk of repetitive flood damage to buildings and structure. And this is especially for structures insured by NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program. So this is a few examples of the kind of things that we've been talking about. Challenges of accessing federal assistance. This is what I mentioned before, in that although this is a huge opportunity, it's unparalleled in the size of the programs and the number of dollars that are available to communities, both at the local and state level. But securing funding can be extremely challenging. It is just to find, because of the sheer amount of information that's out there, sometimes it's difficult to locate the opportunities and make sure that after the NOFOs have published and the funds are out there, finding them, parsing through them for funds meet your priorities and your planning goals. Most local communities do not have either the capability or the capacity to intake that much information, to review it and find the ones that are most applicable to meet their community stakeholder needs. So as a part of this, many of the grants these days that are a part of these different programs we're mentioning offer support, technical assistance support for finding grants, applying for grants, and helping to manage and monitor grant activities. So that's an added bonus to some of these as well. So strategy to prioritize them. Identifying your priorities should be done during the planning stage, whether that is during a massive event or it's because in a particular community, you know the needs that you have. If you have equity issues, if you have underserved communities, if you have infrastructure that is aging and you know there are needs surrounding that, identifying those priorities are important in the planning stage. So identifying what they are, what the priorities are, so that you can do more targeted searches for the programs that are out there. Identifying risks, risks that can harm those priorities, fires, floods, cyber attacks, no matter what that is, that helps you hone in on those opportunities and help you to make decisions. Evaluating the risk for the highest vulnerabilities, weighing the likelihood and potential impacts of those different hazards. All of these, as you put together your planning assumptions for what you hope to accomplish and the vision that hopefully you've developed and have community agreement on what those are, helps you hone in on the best places for you to look and where to put your efforts in locating the priorities and the programs that meet those priorities. And then the constant review of these funding opportunities to find the ones that best target the community needs. This sounds big, it sounds like large level of effort, and it is. It's worthwhile, and doing some of these things will hopefully help you hone in on the best places to look. So that's an overview. I know I was talking quickly. There was an awful lot to cover in a short period of time, but I do hope that helps a little bit with an overview of what we're looking at.
I believe, Tracy, we have a few questions for you. One came in from Lauren Atkins of Hot Springs. She said, we have several resilience plans, but they're by department. They're working on a Protect grant application for this year and want to know how they can find data on the costs of property damage to their community due to flooding. Do you have any recommendations there?
So the best, from a flooding perspective, there's an awful lot of information available through FEMA and FIMA that manages the National Flood Insurance Program. So that would be a great place to look. And I believe they have FAQs, they have links, and I believe that they along with, I could think Commerce, has those numbers available.
Great. We got another question from Rebecca Evans. She asked if all of the grants are under the resilience umbrella are subject to Justice 40.
So Justice 40, so that's one that you need to read very carefully. I don't want to make a blanket statement about that. Most of them are. Equity is a lens, kind of, that was a lens of equity with the Justice 40, and through resilience, it was about climate change and nature-based solutions. So there's kind of a focus on those things. They are nuanced throughout the program, but I would say as a blanket statement, equity, whether it's Justice 40 or equity language, is included in much of these new programs.
Great. And I think we have maybe time for one more question before we get to our panel, which we're eager to start. And it's really around sort of the timelines. I know you and I've discussed that some of these programs have really long timelines between when you apply for them and when your project might actually get funded. Could you maybe make some recommendations on if you need something, shorter term? These are the grant programs to be looking at. And really, if you're thinking about, I'm thinking about Brook, for instance, that's a, however many year horizon.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. There are just so many. I can tell you that the technique when we are working with recovery clients, what we usually do is provide what we call fund mapping. And that is just kind of gathering, the macro and micro level information from these programs and trying to align those with priorities to kind of parse down that total amount of programs that you're looking at, so that you can take a deeper dive into looking at which ones, would be the most effective and the most, beneficial to your community.
We have some great projects that we want to talk about as part of our panel. So I'll toss it back to you, Tracy, and I'll bring Mayor Welch into the conversation, and Mayor Bala. And so we have Mayor Kenneth Welch today from the city of St. Petersburg, Florida, joining us, and Mayor Ravinder Bala from the city of Hoboken, New Jersey, to talk about the resilience projects that they've been working on in their communities and how they've actively pursued federal funding for these projects. I'll pass it over to you, Tracy.
Okay, that's great. Welcome, gentlemen. It's good to see you and talk to you today. Thank you for participating in the panel.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Good. Okay, so I've got a few questions to start the conversation here. And the first one is to both of you. I'd like each of you to tell us just a little bit about your city's disaster risks and disaster preparedness needs.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor. Mayor Welch.
Sure.
I love St. Petersburg. It's always great to visit, and hopefully I see you the next time I'm down there.
Love to.
But Hoboken used to. It's 1 square mile. We have about 64,000 residents. We're the third most densely populated city in the country. So that's a brief overview of the city. In terms of our disaster and recovery preparedness needs, Hoboken actually used to be an island. It's on the Hudson River. It abuts the Palisade Cliffs to the west, and that western portion, about a quarter of the portion, used to be part of an island underground below sea level, and is now historic fill. So it's also an area that's very vulnerable to the effects of climate change and flooding. So we have 2 major problems. One is coastal surge from the Hudson River when you have major impacts such as Superstorm Sandy, which was a major event related to coastal surge. And then on a year-by-year basis, which is happening at a more fast and severe clip, chronic flooding. So we have a combined sewer overflow, a CSO system, where if the system reaches capacity, you have the water simply coming up onto the streets. And with a large portion of the city below sea level being coastal, that chronic flooding is something that the city's been dealing with for decades now. That's a basic overview of some of the challenges we face as they relate to disaster and recovery.
Excellent. Mayor Welch?
And Mayor Bala, looking forward. We ought to grab a cup of coffee the next time you're in St. Pete. But a lot of what you're saying it echoes down to St. Pete. Today is day 90 since we dealt with Hurricane Milton that came through, and Hurricane Milton was 13 days after Hurricane Helene. And I'm a St. Pete resident, grew up here, so 60 years I've been here, and we've never had the impact of storm surge and rain events that we've had in these 2 events. We have planned for a long time in St. Pete, Pinellas County, Tampa Bay, for the impacts of sea level rise and extreme weather. Much of our compact is based on the Miami Broward model. So we knew, change was coming. We believed in the science. We've invested in our infrastructure. The problem is that the rate of change is so rapid. Instead of looking at 2 to 7 feet of impact in 2050, we saw that impact in 2024. It was the first time that we've ever had to shut down 2 of our 3 wastewater plants, plants, because of the level of storm surge that was being generated by Hurricane Helene. These plants are at least 70 years old and have never been impacted. And so what we've learned out of this is, again, we've had flooding events inland, Mayor, in places that have never flooded before. And so dealing with the rapid change and the rapid impact of sea level rise and climate change is something our community has learned. We've had 15,000 structures impacted by those 2 hurricanes. Again, the first time we've ever had to shut down our potable water system in the city of St. Petersburg and had a citywide boil water notice because we love trees, but hundreds of trees were knocked down by Hurricane Milton. And as they fell over, they disrupted the distribution system. And so instead of having 2 or 3 big breaks, we had hundreds of small breaks throughout the system. And so it really was a wake-up call for us. And I think the thing that we took away from that is, yes, and I loved your planning phases, Tracy, assess your challenges, have an assessment, but you also have to be agile and change your plan if you see the environment changing. That's where we are now. And the federal partnership, the state partnership is essential, but we're also going to need some local support. We're looking at $1 billion to get our stormwater system where it needs to be. And so it's really a change in our approach to how we fund those and how rapidly we can fund those improvements.
Yeah, those are great overviews of kind of some of the cause and effect or that's necessary to take into account when we talk about resiliency. So Mayor Welch, you guys experience climate risk, sea level, storm surges, and all of that. What about the status of some of those recovery efforts that are already in process here that you were just talking about? How far along are you guys, and how long is it taking?
Well, I think it's a good opportunity to kind of live the talk of equity. And it's much easier if your community understands um, the administration's approach on equity. As you can see, these are what I call the 6 I's of inclusive governance that we've had in practice since I was elected 3 years ago. And you can see intentional equity is part of that. So it's not new. It's not something new we're trying to build into resilience. It's just our way of work. And I think this was a good example this time. So debris has been my life, like many mayors all across the nation. We have moved 2 million cubic yards of debris in under 90 days, which is more than the last 3 hurricanes combined times 5. That's how much debris we've moved. But we were telling folks, once the debris is a short-term problem, it's how we rebuild in those areas that continue to be impacted. Do we rebuild? Do we, of course, with the 49% rule or the 50% rule, some folks won't be able to rebuild, and the state of Florida is stepping in with an Elevate Florida program to help some of those homeowners, and some will actually abandon those properties. So it's really a new day in terms of how we rebuild St. Petersburg and the greater Pinellas County, Tampa Bay area to be resilient going into the future. Because if we don't make those changes in policy, build smarter, in some places probably not rebuild at all, then we will have, critical impacts to our economy going forward, and we will not be resilient. But those are difficult conversations that we knew were coming, and now is the time that we have to have them.
Absolutely. So Mayor Bala, so you guys were featured in a New York Times article for innovation around nature-based solutions for flood prevention. Can you tell us a little bit about how that work that began after Sandy continues to benefit your community residents today, and where you are in that process?
Sure. So after Superstorm Sandy, we realized that climate change is an emergency. the mayor at the time called for a climate emergency, that it is an existential threat to the city of Hoboken. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal that said that listed Hoboken as one of 10 cities that in 50 years won't exist. So if we do nothing, so we're doing something so that we exist. That's why we call it an existential threat. It's a threat to our existence. So that required drastic action, and we went to the Dutch. We went and worked with a company in the Netherlands that had been looking at the size of climate change, but also how to develop a resiliency plan that would break that cycle of destruction and rebuilding and destruction and rebuilding, and create an innovative, comprehensive plan through design that would make Hoboken sustainable for generations to come, and really break that cycle that we're talking about of destruction and rebuilding. That was coterminous with a process led by the Obama administration under Secretary Sean Donovan at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, called Rebuild by Design. They're looking for innovative ways to protect U.S. cities from climate disasters. We competed in that project and were awarded $250 million for what we call Rebuild by Design. And Rebuild by Design is essentially a model that can be replicated in other coastal communities across the country that uses, as you mentioned, nature-based solutions. So Superstorm Sandy created a bathtub effect in Hoboken from the north and the south. The coastal surge breached the city, and we're aiming through what's called the resist structure. We're not using seawalls to keep the water out, but we are creating berms that are underneath parks so that we can use open space as a defense against flooding, park benches that create resist structures, essentially taking integrating these flood protection barriers into the urban landscape, so you don't even see them. You can actually be sitting at a park bench or at a mural and not know that that mural is a form of flood mitigation or defense against coastal surge. Or you can be at a park and not realize that below that park is a berm that we've developed to protect against another Superstorm Sandy. So that's kind of a snapshot of the innovation behind Rebuild by Design. We're in the active construction phase right now. So there's a lot of pain right now. Sure, we call it short. I'm trying to say short-term pain for long-term gain. But we're finally in the construction phase. But this started under the Obama administration. It's gone through, after his administration, the Trump administration, then the Biden, and now going into the Trump administration again. But we're barreling through, and we're committed to getting this project done. It's historic for the city of Hoboken. It's meant to protect not just the residents who live here now, but future generations when I'm long gone and we're all long gone, and to keep the city resilient for generations to come. So.
Yeah, that is pretty amazing. So what the overall timeline how many years is that?
We were initially awarded the funding in 2015. There's a very intensive regulatory process that is required to actually reach what's called a record of decision, go through an environmental impact study, multiple phases of diligence that gets involved. It's actually a state project administered by the state of New Jersey in partnership with HUD and with the city of Hoboken. But we reached a record of decision in about 2018 and began the construction phase about a year ago. Hope to complete that construction phase within the next couple of years.
Wow, That's amazing. And I think it's very important to call out in that description that you just gave. That's very typical of these programs that we're talking about that are out there now. There's a level of rigor there that is required, and the compliance is fairly strict, not just on environmental, but all of the other, federal aspects of rules that have to be followed. So it's pretty comprehensive, and it's pretty well detailed. So yeah, thanks for that. That's amazing. So Mayor Welch, after Helene and Milton, I was down in Sarasota as well, and I'm doing work back and forth now in Asheville, and in seeing it up close and personal. I know it's always hard to communicate, even in Florida, where these events happen quite frequently. It's really hard to communicate expectations for timelines for recovery. It always takes longer than you'd like for it to. And sometimes that recovery life cycle gets spread out a little bit if you're trying to build back better. So describe to us like where you guys are right now after Helene and Milton. And are you looking at any opportunities, or have you seen anything that you could give us an example of in finding ways to build back better?
Well, yeah, I can say, first of all, this was in the midst of the election season, and I was really elated that the federal and state government, so I'm in Florida, so Governor DeSantis and the Biden administration really were working well together to address the need, as well as the elected officials, because of the impact of those storms. But, FEMA, the Florida Department of Emergency Management, all working together to address the needs. And our message from day one, even before Milton got here, was that this would be a long recovery and far past just getting the debris removed. We would have to rebuild in a smarter way. And the state and FEMA are on the same page. It goes back to the 50% rule. If you've got these repetitive loss areas, it makes no sense to just rebuild the same way. And so even though that's a hard discussion, and we've had, virtual town halls, in-person town halls, brought all the agencies in together to talk to the public about what would be required. It's a conversation you have to have, because if you just rebuild the same way, you're going to be just as susceptible going forward. So I think having that consistent message that it's more than just the debris at your curb, it is how we rebuild in the city of St. Pete and Pinellas County and Tampa Bay going forward. And if we do that, we've got a partner. And so the state of Florida is moving in the direction, and they've announced Elevate Florida. They're going to help those folks, whether they want to elevate, rebuild, or abandon their property, and allow cities and counties to focus on our infrastructure, which is a big ticket item as well. And so we've just been consistent in those messages. Folks, if you've been hit 2 or 3 times, you can understand the frustration, and it just comes with leadership, Mayor Ball. I'm sure you can relate to it, that you're going to just have to have the conversations, let folks vent if they must. They created a character for me called Welch Pile, so they were naming the piles of debris after Welch. And I said, look, if that makes you feel better, great. It'll be gone in 90 days, and then we can talk about the real issues of how we rebuild these communities. And guess what? It's gone. It was gone before Christmas. But folks are going to vent. If you've been hit 2 or 3 times, all your possessions are on the curb, you can understand the frustration. And so that's where, leaders have to be a little empathetic and have some grace for folks. But you still have to have that honest conversation that, hey, some folks might not be able to rebuild where you've been, and you have to look at these other options. So I think it's being consistent in that, relying on data and science, that eliminates a lot of the partisan back and forth, broadening your coalition of community and business leaders to support what you're doing. And in our case, whenever the military, the Coast Guard and MacDill weigh in and say, yeah, it's a real issue that we need to plan for, that helps kind of settle the conversation. So it has to be inclusive, and an honest conversation.
Absolutely. And we've got a question about solutions being needed yesterday. What, if anything, can be done to greatly speed up the processes? Cities can't wait. Vendors perhaps can't sustain for a decade waiting to win an award. So, and please elaborate. So I can't do much elaboration. I can give you an overall take just from what I know about how long it takes at the federal level for these programs. And, you know, I separate them into kind of the resilience, equity kind of framework, and then the typical recovery and mitigation opportunities that have been there for years. They're all bureaucratic to a certain degree. I think it's important to understand that where programs, particularly FEMA, public assistance, infrastructure, mitigation grants, both 406 and 404, you know, those are pretty much, you know, rote for us now. We've been doing it for years. We know approximately how long it takes. And there are some complications that come up, particularly with environmental and historic preservation issues, you know, wherever the damage has been sustained. Those are not taking, you know, any longer than they normally do. What we're seeing is, and I think Mayor Bala, when you were talking about how long it's taken you from Sandy until now, you know, working on these types of things. When you get out into these newer programs, the program management of it, the review processes and all of that are fairly new. I think they're working on ways to simplify as much as they can and to work a little bit more quickly. But I think that's going to take a minute. And the only advice that I would have is compressing that time frame on locating the grants you're interested in, matching those to your community priorities, and making sure that you don't miss deadlines for getting your, you know, your hat in the ring for those. That, I think, if you can become the most effective that you can become in doing that, whether it's reaching for outside technical assistance or getting your grants management departments or all of your departments that deal with grants management more familiar with them, the better off we'll be. Sorry, I don't have a better answer there, but I don't think there is one, honestly, right now.
Tracy,
they're all new within a year or two, you know, being implemented. So I just think it's kind of the nature of the beast for now.
Tracy,
Mayor Bala? Yeah.
Yeah, I would add, if I may, I get that question a lot. You know, you've got this, you know, this amazing, expensive project, Rebuild by Design. It was awarded in 2015. It's 2024, but we're getting these horrendous rainstorms that are flooding our homes. Like we're getting them today. So what do? We can't wait for 3 years. We can't wait for 4 years. We need relief now. What do we do now to protect against more severe impacts of climate change? So what my administration has been able to do, you know, it's not a holistic solution, but we've developed what's called resilient homes guidelines. So for any homes that are in the floodplain that are vulnerable to flooding when we have these wet weather events, we have workshops where we bring in the vendors who can create. So that the idea is to make sure that your home, you can do whatever you can to make your home resilient against flooding, resilient against having your basement flooded, the impacts, and you know, whether it's vendors who install wet weather pumps, whether if you want a green roof to mitigate flooding in your property or your neighborhood, creating a rain barrel in your backyard, connecting residents so that they can make the investments in their properties to make their own individual property more resilient while we wait for these broader policy solutions to make the whole city resilient, is an interim solution that a resident can take, before these larger federal projects come to fruition. That's all I'd add.
Yeah.
And I'd add that
Great
you
information.
yeah, I'd agree with that, and I'd add that it's about priorities, and strangely enough, our second budget public hearing that we have every year had to be delayed because of Hurricane Milton. But the citizens who came to that were literally begging us to put more money into stormwater, and just having the money there doesn't mean you can spend it efficiently, but we've got the consensus, I think, to speed up what's already in our CIP. And so I've asked our public works staff to look at everything in our 5-year CIP, about $750 million, and see what can be moved up and used efficiently. And we're also going to have to go out and look at other ways to raise local funding, because you're not going to get all of your needs funded through federal or state. And so you got to have that local resource. And for us, we've got some issues that we're going to bring the city council and the community up to, and including a referendum to fund that through a bond. And we have a penny for Pinellas infrastructure sales tax that basically has handled all of our capital for 4 decades. But this would be something we think is worthy of asking the public, do you want to pay for, a level of resilience that we don't have now through this tax? And so everything has to be on the table. If we kick it down the road another generation, it'll be too late. So it takes a little bit of, if not us, then who mentality.
Yeah. Well, and I love the approach that you both have laid out here. What you're describing is that integrated approach where you don't look for it all in one place and you don't put all of your eggs in that one basket, right? Some of it is at the local and state level, some of it is at the federal level, and then some of it is at the individual level and the stakeholders in your communities. And that leads me to the next question. I don't want to limit it to this, but I'm very interested, and I'm sure the audience is, on codes and standards and elevating some of the basic mitigation fundamentals that help in areas like yours, where you're finding success and where you're finding some trouble getting buy-in about making some of those things happen. They've been proven to be effective, but they're hard to implement. So what are your thoughts on that? Either one or both of you?
Well,
I'm sorry, Mayor.
Well, I would just say, housing has been one of our pillars for some time. And we have used, for example, ARPA funding. We use the highest percentage of ARPA funding of any city in the state of Florida for housing. And so we've also created a CRA that covers most of South St. Petersburg. Housing is one of the things that CRA funds. And so we've been having an equity lens on that for some time. To me, this is just the next step in doing that for those folks in lower income areas of the city. One of the issues we're having on the coastal areas that have traditionally flooded is the fact that elevating is $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 per home. And so we've gone through the grant making process, working with FEMA, and had a small number of those approved. But that is where the relationship with the state and what the state is planning through Elevate Florida, I think, is going to really be helpful. Still said, there are some of those properties that really, at the end of the day, should be abandoned, and we need to have that conversation. But there's a range of what can happen in a particular neighborhood or a particular part of the city. So we've always faced it from an equity lens, understanding that those folks that make 80% AMI, those folks that haven't had to deal with it, really don't have the wherewithal to deal with it. And so that's why we use those other funds for that purpose.
Great. Well,
Mayor Bala?
Yeah, just briefly, we had to update our building code to comply with the FEMA flood maps because so much of Hoboken was in the floodplain. A lot of residents live in their garden unit, which is the surface or oftentimes subsurface portion of a home. So for a portion of the city, we had to develop codes that would not prohibit an individual to habitate or live in those vulnerable portions of their homes. And it involved a little bit of rejiggering as to whether or not we'd allow that homeowner to build, above 40 feet, which is like the standard, to go up to 50 feet since they're losing 10 feet at the ground floor. So, we're making those adjustments. The good news is that once rebuild by design is completed, 70% of Hoboken will be outside the floodplain, so we can adjust those codes. And in our environmental justice communities within the Hoboken Housing Authority, we'll have 100% of the housing authority outside the floodplain. So we do view this project from the lens of equity, because the communities that were most impacted were within our public housing. So this investment really is taken also from the standpoint of environmental justice as well.
Mayor Bala,
Amazing.
thank you. Thank you, Mayor Welch. Thank you, Tracy, for today's discussion. I know I personally learned a lot, and I bet most of our participants did so as well. We're asking that all of you please fill out our Zoom poll, which should be on your screen right now. We really use the information we glean from these surveys to help with our programming, to make them as relevant as possible for what you all are facing out across the country. We also hope that you will consider applying to our local infrastructure hub winter boot camp. The registration deadline is January 22nd. You can find the link in the chat. To date, our boot camps have helped small and medium-sized cities develop competitive grant applications for federal resources. So far, we've helped 90 cities secure more than $315 million in federal resources. So if you're a small or medium-sized city looking for help with federal grant infrastructure applications, please sign up for our boot camp. And for the very first time, our winter boot camp will also be helping cities of all sizes with project implementation. So if your city has won a federal infrastructure grant, our team is ready, willing, and able to help you with procurement, with federal grant compliance, with project permitting. You can also register for the same winter boot camp through the link in the chat. We also encourage all of you to keep an eye out for an upcoming report from the U.S. Conference of Mayors. It'll feature 4 cities' resiliency efforts, including the resources that they're using to fund their work. And finally, just a reminder, as always, please check out our website, localinfrastructure.org. We have a full event calendar on our website, and we're adding materials and resources all the time to it. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.